Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the center, but also our co-sponsor, the National History Center, directed by Professor Roger Lewis, here this afternoon. The seminar is a weekly seminar co-sponsored by the two organizations, but with very much with support from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, and so we want to acknowledge that support, and I also like to acknowledge the help, the assistance that Roger and I get from Marianne Barber over at the National History Center, the associate director there, and from my team, Alison Lilakoff is in Hong Kong this week, but a couple of my assistants are around to help with the program. Today, of course, we are very fortunate to have with us John Voll, one of the leading Arabists of this country, close by from Georgetown University. I'll introduce him in just a moment. I want to remind everybody, though, that next week is President's Day, federal holiday, so the center will be closed for business, and so our next session will be on Monday, February 27th, with a talk by Sherry Brown Wells on Jean Monnet and the Future of Europe, based on her new book, her new biography on Monet. That will be February 27th at 4 o'clock, as always, here in the Moynihan boardroom. As mentioned, we're very fortunate to have one of this country's leading lights on Islamic history with us today. John Voll is Professor of Islamic History and Associate Director of the Prince Alawite bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard, taught Middle Eastern and world history for 30 years at the University of New Hampshire before moving to Georgetown. He's a specialist in modern Islamic history and the author of Islam, Continuity and Change in the Modern World, among numerous other books and articles. He's a past president of the Middle East Studies Association and of the New England Historical Association, has served on the boards of a number of important historical organizations, including the boards of director of the American Council of Learned Societies and the World History Association. And he was awarded in 1991 the Egyptian Presidential Medal in recognition for scholarship on Islam. So much for the formal introduction. We're delighted that you're here with us today. And I'll turn it over to Roger for additional introductory remarks, and I think starting us on our usual introductions of all the people around.
We are very glad that so many people are able to be here this afternoon. We would like to go around the table and let just everyone introduce themselves very briefly. The microphone is there, so shall we begin with you, Marian?
I'm Marian Barber from the National History Center.
Philippa Strum, a senior scholar at the Wilson Center.
I'm Destiny Decker. I'm just a student.
Emily Brown, just a student and intern at Council of Women World Leaders.
I'm Robert Baum. I'm a residential fellow at the center and normally teach at the University of Missouri.
I'm a Professor Sarpi Sanjar from Ankara University, Gender Studies Center, as a visiting scholar here.
My name is Miroslav Ružica, the World Bank retiree, coming from Belgrade, Serbia.
Thomas Adams, a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and European historian. Thank you.
I'm Julien Defer. I'm just an intern here, and I'm coming from France.
Justin Bonner, student. Yuri Kim, Junior Scholar at Woodrow Wilson Center.
Mindy Rodner from IFAS.
Steve Weissman.
Daniel Adams.
Dave Rogers, independent historian and Woodrow Wilson Center hanger-on.
James Sang, IBM retired.
Daniel Morrow, Johns Hopkins. I am studying the Maghreb countries.
Albert Beveridge, American Historical Association.
Ronald Steele, Wilson Center Senior Scholar.
Yasemin Akbaba, Gettysburg College.
Angela Santese, Junior Scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Orrin Oslin, Junior at Rutgers University and a Research Assistant in the Middle East Program.
Eugenia Schenecker, Department of Labor, retired.
Katrina Ecker, I'm an intern at the Austrian Embassy.
Christine Kelly, I'm an intern with the National History Center.
Irfan Nuruddin, I'm a residential fellow at the Wilson Center and a professor at Ohio State.
Jim Sanders, retired State Department Nigeria Watcher.
John Campbell, Council on Foreign Relations in New York.
Shobana Shankar at Georgetown in the History Department.
Phil Zager, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies.
Dave Ottaway, Senior Scholar, Wilson Center.
Carol Migdalovitz, formerly of CRS.
Don Wolfensberger, I run the Congress programs here at the Wilson Center.
Alan Kraut, I teach history at American University.
David Kyvig, I used to teach history at Northern Illinois University, now happily annuitized and working at the Library of Congress.
Dale Brzezinski, Washington Report and Middle East Affairs.
Arnita Jones, retired, American Historical Association.
John, it gives us great pleasure to have you here this afternoon. I would merely add to what Christian has already said that John is one of our foremost Arabists in the country, not only a historian, but a past president of the Middle East Studies Association. John Vall on Islam and Democracy for the 21st Century.
Well, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here. I notice we've got a nice, long, narrow room, and I'm tempted almost to take the microphone as a walk-around. I'm the son of a Methodist minister, and, you know, that sometimes gives you a little more sense that you should be mobile and should be getting out into the aisles. But at any rate, I want to thank the Wilson Center and the National History Center for this opportunity to talk with you. And I use those words very specifically, to talk with you. The subject, Islam and Democracy in the 21st Century, is one of those, for me, one of those kind of strange to define subjects in relationship to what I do. 15 years ago, a colleague of mine and I, John Esposito, we wrote a book called Islam and Democracy in the mid-1990s. That was the product of sort of 10 or 15 years of contact with people and politicians and political Islamic movements and so on, and so that was a nice kind of end point. But of course, in the past 15 years, lots of things have happened. And so Oxford University Press was hinting that, you know, maybe this subject has a little more to be said about it. And John and I said, we don't want to do a second edition because we think that there is so much that has happened in the last 15 years that simply an updating won't work. And so we are at the beginning of a new set of activities. And it's starting afresh, so that in a sense, even though this is a subject I've been working on for maybe 30, 35 years, it's also a subject that I'm just starting to work on. And I'm looking forward to having us have some discussion, so I will try not to talk too long. I want us to look at this picture. Some of you, maybe all of you, will recognize this as Meydan Tahrir, Liberation Square in Cairo, in the midst of the high involvement of large numbers of people in what has now come to be called the Arab Spring. This is an interesting visual image. I've got some visual images that I want to use. I'm an old geezer, and I've suddenly discovered electronics. And it's kind of fun to be able to make use of stuff that I couldn't use when I started teaching. But what I want us to do as well is not just look at nice pictures and have a nice story about the Arab Spring, but I think it is important for us to recognize that the changes that are taking place are so important and so profound that maybe our vocabulary for analyzing what's going on isn't up to snuff yet. Now, what I want us to do then is to think in terms of our visual imagery, our information access, sourcing, what's going on, and for starts, just to be reminded that many of the terms that we use, like Islam, like democracy, like secularism, like elections, in the past 15 years have changed in their implications because of the way the world has changed. And our words themselves, we still use words that we used to use, but now they take on different meaning. And my son, who is very adept in the electronic sorts of things, and I were talking yesterday about what kind of words. And, he suggested the following that, since I was an old geezer, I could use as a reminder, that I can remember when houses had windows. I can remember when churches had icons, and I can remember when Moses had a tablet. That as we look at what we're doing, I can remember when birds twittered. I can remember when hacking was a foul in basketball. All of these sorts of things. And what I'd like to suggest is that maybe we also need to have this same recognition that when we use democracy as a term, when we use election as a term, when we use secularism and so on, when we use these terms, in 2012, these terms have a different connotation than they did even just 10 or 15 years ago. And I'd like to use as an example, as a visual example for the moment, what we now think about as the repertoire of how one participates in movements of contention, movements of opposition, movements of participation in the political public sphere. We're all used to this. This looks familiar. But this picture is only possible now. 15 months ago, this was not a picture that anybody would have conceived of. And I'm not saying it's not a picture that nobody would have conceived of because Mubarak was such an authoritarian dictator that nobody was ever going to throw him out. I'm going to say that this is a picture that when we talk about demonstrations in Cairo, this is not what would have come to mind a year and a half or 2 years ago. I've lived in Cairo. I've been to Cairo. I've been part of demonstrations in Cairo. The good old days of demonstrations. There are dissertations written before I was there on the WAFT Party in the 1920s and 1930s. The WAFT Party could get 50,000, 100,000 people out onto the streets, but how you did it was they sent their messengers around to the coffee houses. And they shuffled people, and they a little bit of money slipped under the backgammon tables and things like that, and you could get a crowd out. A demonstration was very simple. You would sort of get the crowd out, and well, I broke my laser pointer a little while ago, so I'm going to stand up for a minute. I'm not going to wander around, I promise. But This bridge here goes across to the Gezira, the island, and the university is over on the other side. And if you wanted to have a big demonstration, this used to be the old-fashioned checkpoint. You would get 10,000 students from the University of Cairo, and they would kind of march across the bridges, and then they would get to what was then Farouk Square, not Liberation Square. But you would come, you would march. The real problem was to try and get yourself across the bridges and so on. You would get up in the morning, you would go out and you would march around, you would shout, you would slogan, you would make posters, and then at night you would go home. There was never a time when you had a demonstration that set up tents in a public space with the demonstrators staying there for more than a day. This is a new invention. And if you do your Googling, if you look, in the last year, we have moved into a new era of public modes of participation in movements of contention. And you start. I mean, and this, I would call your attention basically. You know, 150 years ago, in 1848, if you were going to have a revolution, the cry was, "To the barricades." And these are the barricades. You couldn't really have a respectable revolution in the second half of the 19th century if you didn't have barricades. You had the barricades, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo. That was the new idiom. Before that, you had mass petitions. If you're somebody like Charles Tilley in social movement theory, was doing research in the 18th century protest kind of things, and then got to the 1830s, and he looked at what he was looking at, and he said, you know, the whole mode of protest in the 1830s was remarkably different from what was happening in the mid-18th century. And this is not a quiz or a test, but let me do for my own. If I said one of the great modes of popular protest participation in some time past was a shivaree, how many would be able to define what a shivaree is? I mean, I'm sort of curious. Anybody? I had a student in my Islamic movements class who said he'd actually been in a shivaree because he lived out in the Midwest, and his mother had a second marriage, and lived in a rural area. Now, a shivaree nowadays, if there is such a thing anymore, I mean, it's now a wedding night celebration where all of the friends go and they bang pots and pans and make noise all night so that the newlyweds can't sleep. In the old days, it was a protest against landowners, and you would march out, and the peasants would humiliate the landowner by banging pots and pans in the street in front. Now, I haven't seen any shivarees in Washington. But we've got this, you know, the shivarees were replaced by barricades, if you will. And then, in the 20th century, you had the beginning of what this is the one kind of settled tent demonstration that I can think of. And this is the here in Southeast Washington, this is the Bonus Army encampment in 1932. But the Bonus Army encampment was a settlement in a Hooverville, the poor and unemployed kind of shack town. It was not part of the demonstration. That the veterans lived here, but they would march then down to the mall and then come back again. But you had then the beginnings of what became the mid-20th century big thing that we're still basically living with, and that is the protest mode of the March on Washington. And so this is the classic, the biggest and the best. This is Martin Luther King. This is 1963. This is the March on Washington. But if you look, and some of you may be old enough to have participated or to have been there, if you look, there aren't any tents there. And when they got done speeching at the Lincoln Monument, everybody went home. And so that our real kind of movement then that we're seeing now is a new movement and it feeds on itself globally. That there are lots of different articles and analyses that talk about the influence on what becomes then in the United States the Occupy movement. And the Occupy movement was looking at the older kind of encampment things. And so that in the Portland Occupy movement, for example, there was a sign. At least somebody had taken American history and knew what was happening. And there's this sign, "Remember the Bonus Army." Now, the journalist who was writing the story said she had to go and look it up. But you have this kind of encampment mode of protest, which the Occupy movement gives us. So that we're really, I think, dealing with now a new repertoire, a new vocabulary of political involvement and protest. And so I think as we look at the Arab Spring, we can talk about whatever you want to talk about once I shut up. But the Arab Spring, I don't want to sort of describe the events, but I want to use the Arab Spring as a way of reminding us that when we talk about Islam and democracy and so on in the 21st century, there are new dimensions to it that didn't appear, for example, in much of the discussions and in John and my book in 1995. The first new reality is really something that people notice and then it gets dropped. This is the Arab Spring is in many fundamental ways a non-ideological event or development or movement. Right at the very beginning, Michael Slackman in the New York Times really put his finger on it. You know, he talks about the different kinds of movements. You know, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution introduced the Muslim world to the force of political Islam, which frightened entrenched leaders as well as the West. That ideology still has a powerful hold on people's imagination, but continues to feed jihadist movements. But like Arabism and Arab socialism before it, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now you're going to get stuck with a bunch of faces because I think I like to remind people that ideologies aren't they don't come in tablets from the sky. Ideologies come through the mouths and the minds of people. And so that Michael Slackman is saying, but like Arabism and socialism before it, the political thought of Ruhollah Ayatollah Khomeini and the radicalized ideology of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden have failed to deliver in practical ways. And therefore, you don't see the kind of stuff that when I was a graduate student in the 1960s, in the heyday of Nasser's Arab socialism, you had ready-made slogans. There's ready-made slogans of Arab socialism and radicalism. And there was a slogan that was quoted somehow that didn't quite have the same force to it, ideological force, in a news article just a couple of weeks ago, which was basically it said, open up the party, bring the belly dancer, my chest is big enough to take the bullets of a martyr. And now somehow that I asked my Islamic movements class, this didn't really strike me as a good marching slogan. You know, call out the party, call out the belly dancer, and so on. But somebody had actually heard the slogan, and it's a marvelous marching slogan because in Arabic it has good meter to it. But that's, call out the party people, call out the belly dancer. That's not what people marched to in the days of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and that's certainly not what they marched to with the Ayatollah Khomeini. Instead, what we've got is a new style of voice, a new voice. Some of you may recognize Wael Ghanem, who is in many ways the voice of the Tahrir movement. He is not a radical socialist. He's not an Islamist. He's not a Muslim brother. He was a Google executive for the Arab world. Really properly typical. And so when he at the end of November had an op-ed piece in the New York Times, he put forward in Bleak Cairo a call for optimism by Wael Ghanem. And, you know, he's talking about, has the revolution failed? He says, no, revolutions take a long time. But he says, Egyptians have many demands. And then, we want the military to quickly present a timetable for a complete transfer of power to civil authorities elected by the people. The People's Assembly, the Shura Council, and the presidency. We want the security system to be rebuilt based on respect for human rights. We want the military to open dialogue with young people and increase transparency by communicating openly through the media. We want a strong government with the authority to fight rampant corruption within its own institutions. Now, that's a pretty good set of demands, but that is not a good old-fashioned political ideology. That is a shift away from the grand imagery of the Islamists or of the old Arab socialists or of the liberal nationalists of the 1920s and 1930s. It represents a new mode of political programmatics, if you will. And so what we've got then is this phase is in debate with this phase. And this phase is, although he is no longer he's no longer able to speak because he's dead. This is Anwar el-Awlaki, the person who speaks with an who spoke with an American accent, who was a major voice, a major concern for American security. But, you know, I have to tell my students, if your name is Ahmed or Layla or something like that, don't go looking for Awlaki's sites because security people might try and catch up with you. But if your name is Lois or Jane or John, maybe. But it's really interesting to look at what are the great popular things from Awlaki. He gave a series of sermons in Arlington when he was in Darul Hijra Mosque in Arlington. And these are still the things that the thing that gets most hits if you go for Awlaki is not his recent jihadi things. It's his lectures on Muhammad, his lectures on the life of Muhammad. And that was a very popular educational kind of discussion where you don't even get much talk about equality and justice and things like that. It's just good, old-fashioned, pious, here's the model life of the Prophet and we should live like him and things like that. And so that, in a sense, what we're dealing with is a post-ideological set of factors that are involved. Now, as we look then at this, I think it becomes useful to look at some other major Islamically identified Muslims. Some scholars, Asaf Bayat and others, have started now talking about the post-Islamist period. I was trying to define post-ideological, more particularist, the post-Islamist period. That Islamically identified parties these days are remarkably newly pragmatic in the way they operate. You have a real difference. If one goes back and looks at the Islamic parties' programs, say in the 1950s or in the 1960s when they almost all disappeared, what you have are old-fashioned approaches to the Sharia, the medieval construct that really conservative and jihadis think of as Islamic law, as Sharia, a very tight, static, formation of stuff. You have the call for a constitution that would say Sharia is the law of the land and our constitution is the Quran and things like that. Relatively straightforward, strict kind of stuff. But in the last 50 years, most of those political parties have become considerably more pragmatic in their political programs. So that my favorite example is the PAS party, P-A-S, which stands for a very long set of Malay names, the Pan-Islamic Party of Malaysia, basically. PAS party started in the early 1950s, and it had this, what I think of as the very standard static Sharia non-dynamic interpretation of Islam as the core of its political program. And it kind of limped and lumped along in Malaysian politics for basically 30 years or so. Always getting maybe 10, 15% of the vote, a little bit more, a little bit less. And we're going to, if I can, I'm going to buzz through because I think he's an interesting man. We'll come back to some of these others. And then this guy is despite his looks, this is Nikmat, who was the leader, the ideological leader of PAS in the 1980s and 90s, who essentially said, we've got to get real. We've got to get real. In the same way that at the beginning of the 1980s, the person who is the head, who is the leader of the Nahda party in Tunisia, Rashid Ghannouchi, said, in the 1970s, we were all listening to the Egyptian radical Sayyid Qutb. We all read his book, Milestones, and so on. But when push came to shove, there was a major labor battle of unions versus the then Bourguiba government. And he said, when we went out, the Islamic tendency movement went out as students to try and help the union people and support them against Bourguiba, we found we didn't have anything to say to them. They weren't interested in Sayyid Qutb's high-flown political theories of Islamic government and the Hakimiyya, and they weren't interested in the effort to try and figure out what were the theological errors of the ways of Bourguiba. They were interested in social justice, economic equity in society, and the Islamic tendency movement in the 1980s became a political Islamic party that was not tied to the old style, but moved into the new. PAS under Nikmat has the same sort of thing. And it moves into then a greater electoral kind of approach. Now we'll get back to where we were here. The first Arab Spring wasn't an Arab Spring. The first Arab Spring was a Southeast Asian Spring. The largest Muslim country in the world had been ruled by a military dictator for decades, Suharto, in Indonesia. But at the end of the 1990s, you had then demonstrations, old-fashioned demonstrations, get up in the morning, have breakfast, go out in the streets and shout, and go home at night. But you had then a series of demonstrations that got the label Reformasi, the reform movement, which gradually sort of made Suharto realize that he didn't have a future, and he was pushed out. Now, a lot of the muscle for the popular opposition to the Suharto regime came from the groups led by these two men. The one with the coat and tie is Amin Rais, who had been the head of an organization called the Muhammadiyah in Indonesia. And the guy with the flashy shirt is Abdurrahman Wahid, who became then the first democratically elected or democratically selected president of Indonesia. And Gusdur Abdurrahman Wahid was the head of something called Nahdlatul Ulama. Now, both of these guys were in the framework of Islamic modernism that goes back to the end of the 19th century. The Muhammadiyah was a major Islamic modernist reinterpretation movement and organization. which essentially said that Muslims had to have a scientific education as well as a social science and humanities education, that you had to be able to reinterpret the Islamic morality to fit the society. The Nahdlatul Ulama, the other movement, was a little more conservative, but Gasdur, the Abdurrahman Wahid, was very strong on there should be no mention of Islamic law in the Constitution, that the government's job is not to ensure the piety of the people, the government's job is to do law and order. Now, these two groups are important because if you look at the demographics, Muhammadiyah has almost 30 million members, and Nahdlatul Ulama has almost 35 million members. That means that there are more members of the organization that the guy in the sports shirt was head of. There are more members of that organization than there are people in Iraq. His organization is bigger than the population of Iraq. And Amin Rais's organization is bigger than the population of Saudi Arabia. You put the two of them together, and you've got, you have those two, you have 60 to 70 million people representing a center of gravity that is really an important thing that should reorient our terminology when we talk about political Islam. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, is very important, and we can talk a lot about how important the Muslim Brotherhood is. Muslim Brotherhood is very important, but it doesn't come close to the membership of these two organizations. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood itself is a different kind of pragmatic, that its pragmatism has been unmasked, if you will. It has always been a pragmatic, let's do what we can to survive, let's do what we can to get support organization from the time of its founder in 1928. Its reputation as a radical support for jihadism is built on a couple of things. One, the Egyptian leaders have tended to say, well, our opposition is this Islamist kind of party, and that was one of those things that could tweak especially American and European policymakers. Oh, good heavens, we don't want fundamentalist ruling a country as important as Egypt. But as you look at the jihadis that usually get identified with the Muslim Brotherhood, and you look at their biographies, they are former Muslim Brotherhood people. That is, they left the Brotherhood because the Brotherhood wasn't ideological enough for them. And so we have this kind of organization. Now, in terms of the new realities, then we have to get used to a non-ideological orientation. And I think that the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab Spring is a place where I would like to suggest it becomes very important. If you read at all about the Brotherhood in contemporary politics in Egypt, most outside observers and many of the non-Islamically oriented political forces in Egypt, the seculars, will tell you that for years the Brotherhood's program was Islam is the solution. Islam huwa al-hal. Islam is the solution. And then the follow-up to that is, but you never know what that solution really means, which this is polite society, so I won't say that that is simply, but I will say that it is wrong. It is in error. If you look at then the people who will say Islam is the solution is just a slogan and you don't know what the Muslim Brotherhood stands for, then 3 paragraphs later in their analysis will say the reason why they got so many votes in the last election was that they had medical clinics in the villages, was that they had literacy clinics, was that they took after the women, they took care of the women. When there was an earthquake in Cairo, it was the Muslim Brotherhood that was able to get blankets to the people who were, and blankets and tents to the people who were casualties a week before the government and so on. And that's, Islam is the solution for the average for the average lower class urban dweller and rural dweller in Egypt, Islam as a solution means that the Muslim Brotherhood comes and helps you with your economic problems. It helps you with your medical problems. It helps you with women's issues, and so on. But that's again, that's not That's not a grand ideology. It is a pragmatic program. Now, in the last few minutes, what I want to do is I've spent a little more time on the non-ideological. We can talk about the other posts, but to me, one of the interesting things is that in this new post-ideological post-demonstrational movement, kind of movistrations. You know, it's a cross between a movement and a demonstration. In the movistrations, a really important dynamic part have been women. That it was a female labor union organizer that brought the Egyptian factory workers union people into the Tahrir organization, and so on. And as you look at the coverage, the coverage in the visual images, a very substantial proportion of the activists in Tahrir Square were like these women. Now, I can go into the fashions here. If you notice that there are 5 women, each of whom would be identified as being muhajiba, as being veiled. But there are 5 different veil styles there. And those 5 different veil styles reflect at least 5 different viewpoints. That you have what I call the one thing in common is that they all have sunglasses on. You know, and they all got pretty expensive sunglasses, as nearly as I can tell. The tall woman has what I call Gucci muhajiba. That is, she's very fashionable. The farthest left is probably the most conservative. She has a tight thing, and she doesn't show her throat or anything like that. And she may even be part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the middle 3 are sort of the middle 3 look to me like good middle-class university students or middle-class younger professional women. They are not making a statement with their veil. This is their way of doing things. The veil is not an issue, one way or the other, in this arrangement. And so you get then interesting matrix of identities in someone like this woman. This is Tawakkul Karman, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who shared the Nobel Peace Prize, and she is the, quote, the mother of the revolution in Yemen. Tawakkul Karman is a member of and an activist in the Islamically identified political party in Yemen, Islah. Under our normal vocabulary, she would then be a jihadi militant in the all-inclusive kind of lumping together that we tend to do. She's an Yemeni Islamist activist, and al-Awlaki was a Yemeni Islamist activist, and so somehow they must be connected. But they aren't, of course. Her major call, again, is not an Islamic Sharia ideological call. Her major call is the pragmatic necessities of economic equality and social justice, and in particular for 2 groups that she is really concentrating on. One is women and women's issues, and we can see this, for example, in the neighboring country, a non-Arab Spring, Arab Spring activity with Saudi women who did the protest against the rule that they can't drive, and this was one of their posters, and so on. The other one, the other cause that she had is the cause of youth and women's equality. Now, I just want you to look. For example, we've got Carmen and we have the other Islamist activist. This is Zaina Anwar, who was the founder and organizer of an organization called Sisters in Islam, which is now a global organization that began in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Zaina doesn't worry about whether or not she's covered. Well, she says she doesn't want to be covered. Tawakkul doesn't worry about whether she's covered, but she wants to be covered. But both of them have the same movement in mind of social justice for women, social justice for the poor, economic equality, and so on. Now, this is where I will kind of finish so that we can talk. It's the danger of talking in a subject like this. I learned my lesson a long, long time ago of if you're going to be talking about current events, don't not listen to the news before you go. I learned that lesson. I was teaching modern Middle Eastern history at the University of New Hampshire. I had an 8 o'clock class in it, and I was teaching it on the day that President Carter's rescue mission for the American hostages in the Tehran embassy failed. And I didn't watch the news. I was going over my class notes, and we were going to be talking about something else, and my students, of course, came in primed to talk about it. Well, this is from today. This is a young woman who is in Bahrain, and I think we can get some interesting sort of problems of our new vocabulary by looking at this picture. The police officer is more veiled than the protester, but the police officer represents a state, Bahrain, that tries very carefully to keep religion and politics, religious identification and political activism separate, because the ruling dynasty in Bahrain is Sunni and the majority of the population is Shi'i. And so this is a police officer for a state that's trying to keep religion and politics separated. And the young woman is another Zaina. The young woman is Zaina, who has been in and out of jail since last September, at least I think about 6 times. And her major source of influence, other than sitting and arguing with police officers, is she's a blogger. And she is making use then of the whole new mechanism that is available for someone like this Zaina, that you can be in the public sphere, you can be demonstrating in the public sphere, regardless of how isolated you are in pure spatial terms, because the blogosphere becomes a new area of conflict and demonstration. So in all of this, where do we sit? We've got all of the ways of expressing opposition and governmental policy in the political arena are rapidly changing. And so that as we look at Islamic identities, the Islamic identities are changing. Whether we're looking at this Zaina or see if I can, or this Sufi leader. This is Ajam, who is a televangelist in Indonesia, or my friend Anwar Ibrahim, who is the leader of the opposition in Malaysia, or Erdogan, who is leader of the AKP party in Turkey, or then are going back to our very conservatively dressed but mentally radical leader of the PAS. In this kind of a world, we have to be open to the idea that there are many, many different voices that are articulating many, many different programs in many different ways, with the new elements being the electronic mobility, with the new elements being the non-ideological pragmatism, the new elements being the increasingly substantial involvement of women and the increasingly substantial involvement of young people. So that Islam and democracy in the 21st century is a very important set of subjects that we've got to get used to the fact that those subjects have to be discussed in ways that are probably pretty different from what we did in, say, 15 years ago. Thank you. So, anybody want to? I'll let you.
Sure. The floor is open for questions. Yeah, Flip. If you can please wait for the microphone. Why don't you go ahead and just state your name again to remind.
Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you so much. That's really so interesting. I'm wondering, you talked about the different nature of demonstrations, the infinitely more pragmatic nature of the demonstrators, and the relatively recent involvement of women in the demonstrations. And are you suggesting cause and effect? How are you pulling those things together? Could you do that for us?
Well, the answer is yes, I'm suggesting that. And right now I'm in the process of trying to figure out how you can pull all of these things together. Because I think that we really don't have what I think of as an appropriate explanatory narrative. I mean, that we are I think in terms of social science and the humanities for examining Islam and democracy. We are in a kind of parallel, if we use the good old-fashioned Thomas Kuhn kind of structure of scientific revolution kind of things. We are in a point where the old analytical paradigm has too many holes in it, and the potentially new paradigms are not yet being shaped. I mean, I like to put together two quotes. That in 1968, Arnold Toynbee, the great world historian, was writing a foreword to a book on religion and society. And that was in the high heyday of modernization theory, and everybody knew that religion was disappearing. And Arnold Toynbee wrote, "All current religions, whether tribe-bound or missionary, or higher or lower, have been losing their hold on the hearts and consciences and minds of their former adherents." About at the end of last year, Scott Taylor in Foreign Affairs had an article essentially on the future of God in world affairs. And Scott Taylor says, "Around the world, from the southern United States to the Middle East, religion is on the rise. The major world religions are all taking advantage of the opportunities provided by globalization to transform their messages and reach a new global audience." Now, those two quotes, both of them are stated in times when they were quite confident they weren't going to be contradicted. But probably the last vestige of good old-fashioned modernization theory that still hangs around is the tension between religion viewed as the old-fashioned way of doing things and secularism as the newfangled way of doing things, and this kind of tension. We don't have a new narrative yet, I don't think. I think we're coming to a narrative, but we are still in what I think of as the post stage. As you look, anybody who's trying to connect all of these things, they're saying, well, we've got the post-feminist stage of female involvement. We have Jürgen Habermas is talking about the post-secular stage of the public sphere. We have people talking about the post-Islamist stage, and we have people talking about the post-modern, all of this sort of post-industrial. We're posted, like a refrigerator. We're so posted that we're still tied. Postmodern is still tied to modern. Post-Islamist is still tied. And what we need at this point is to break out of the post-dash mentality to see that we are dealing with a new kind of phenomenon. And here I would see us as being involved then. I mean, the narrative, the one line of narrative that I would see is that we have to increasingly recognize the role, the continuing and absolutely significant role of religion in society, and of religion in politics, and of religion in personal life. But that religion is different from what religion was 20 years ago. And so I'm struggling with narrative, rather I'm struggling with how do you put all of these things together. But that's of course why it's fun. I mean, when I was a graduate student, everybody knew what was going to happen. And so you really didn't have to think anything. All you had to do was fill in the gaps. Sorry.
Great. Thank you. I think, Anita, there was some question down here? Okay, yes.
Alan Kraut, American University. I guess in looking at this pragmatism that you describe, how pragmatic is their perception of the opposition? Do they understand the nature of the opposition, and is this a kind of idealism that comes from youth and university life, or is it a much more realistic kind of pragmatic view of what the odds are against their movement in changing the nature of belief and government in the Middle East? I couldn't help, because I tend to be kind of a cynic about these things. I looked at that young man who was the Google executive, so bright, so filled with ideas and enthusiasm, and I couldn't help ask myself, where will they find his body? Because, in fact, the opposition within Egypt to the movement that he represents is significant, and it's not going away.
And I think that one of the, just sort of to follow up the gloom for a minute, I mean, I do think that many of the people who are involved, like Zaina in Bahrain, recognize that the probability that they're going to find her body rather than picking her up, being released from jail, that probability is high. And that this is in a way, this is the new jihadi. That in the old days, you had basically people who were not as well informed, who were willing to be suicide bombers. And today, what you have are people who, in my old-fashioned Methodist liberal socialism, today what you have are people who are willing not to be suicide bombers, but who are willing to give their life if that's what it costs. And I do think that they are aware that many of them are in fact more pragmatically aware than normal youth groups are, normal young people are. I think that the really critical divide and the critical danger is not so much from the pure pragmatic non-ideologues or the more Islamically oriented. Part of the difficulty is with the people, the secularists who are still ideological. And that in Egypt in particular, the danger, so far as I'm concerned, is that the secularists are so used to being afraid of an Islamically identifiable group that they are willing to put up with, as they were for the last 30 years, willing to put up with a military authoritarianism in order to avoid having the Muslim Brotherhood in power. I think that we've got two very interesting dynamics in the cases of Tunisia and Egypt. In Egypt, the more secular, using a label now, but not actually, the secular liberals are not willing to really be a part of a Muslim Brotherhood government. In Tunisia, the secular liberals are in fact liberal and are finding the middle ground and are working to form a center-based coalition between essentially the pragmatic Islamists and the pragmatic secularists. And I think that what is required is for everybody to realize the dangers that are involved, and I agree. And the real problem is, what do you do? What's going to happen? In this, I have no, my crystal ball doesn't work with Syria. Syria, to me, the real horror story test case is Syria, and that the government of the Assad family has long memory, and they remember that when the father of the current leader massacred 30 to 40,000 people with one fell swoop in Homs, the world said, "Oh, this is terrible," and then they just went on. And I think that they are counting on that, and I think that this is where then the price tag can be high. I agree with you. I think that one of the advantages of the new, younger pragmatists, and particularly, I mean, this will sound sexist, but particularly now that we've got females mobilized, there's I have a much better I have much more confidence in the Yemeni movement with people like Tawakkul Karman being there, than not. I think that this broader gender-integrated kind of movement has some real hope.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. My question really follows closely on to Alan's, if not identical, and that is, how naive is this kind of a movement that does not take into account the military that wants stability and maintaining the status quo versus some unidentified future? Most revolutions, we are told, are driven by a central idea, and they succeed if they are grounded in some type of ideology, whether they call it ideology or religion or whatever. And so I guess my question is, when we have a movement that's neither centered or grounded, what will sustain it? What is a movement without a core?
You've just raised another one of those terms that at this point it's not clear what's happening. I mean, some of you may have seen David Ignatius had an essay on the 9th, Egypt's Work in Progress. It's a very good essay and all, but what I found interesting was, you have the discovering groups, the government is claiming outside groups, and then Ignatius says, if you've read Crane Brenton's The Anatomy of Revolution, you know what could be coming next. Widening chaos and economic trauma, a rising chorus of blame against foreign manipulators, followed by the strong leader, the man or mullah on horseback who promises to restore order, security, and national purpose. Now, I'm really old. I'm so old that I took a course with Crane Brenton. And his pattern of revolution was very important for understanding an 18th century revolutions, 19th century revolutions, and some of the 20th century revolutions. Crane Brenton would not have understood if he had stayed within his own. He was a very flexible person, so I'm sure he would have, if he'd lived longer, we would have gotten some very insightful essays about the Iranian Revolution. But the Iranian Revolution, even in 1978-79, really didn't fit into the Thermidor, the Thermidor, Robespierre, Jacobin, Napoleon model. And the significant difference nowadays is the difference in the weaponry, the difference in what you've got. I mean, that you had barricades. See if I can. You had barricades because what you had was cavalry galloping down the street. But cavalry isn't very good against flash mobs. and it's fun to teach. It's fun to teach about how one organizes movements when half of the graduate students in your class participated in the flash mob snowball fight in DuPont Circle 2 years ago. That the mobilization is such that I do think there is some protection from machine guns and horses and tanks and so on, but it is a dangerous thing. But I think that we are now in a new revolutionary mode, and the tricky thing is, will the Chinese mode of coping with new revolution develop more rapidly than the revolutionary develop their mode of coping? But I think at the moment, the new electronic mode for protest in a political but electronic public sphere is at least a new thing that gives some hope for being able to do something with the continuity of military. But
thank you. Okay, let's go on the other side of the table. Yep, gentleman over there.
Dave Rogers. Right in this room, a little over a year ago, a gentleman by the name of Eric Kaufman was sitting right where you are, talking about his book on religious demographics that showed the expansion, not just in the Islamic world, but in this country and particularly in Israel, of this radical sectarian, not just Islamists, but Christianists, the Haredis. How would that point of view put? And I subsequently read Kaufman's book. So how would his paradigm fit into what you're saying? Particularly, I was curious because we talked about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but the Salafis have seemed to have gained a great deal of power in the election as well.
You just answered the question. I mean, no, really, that what you have, one of the things that's happened in Egypt is that for the years of Mubarak, there was a very tight umbrella over all kinds of political activism. And in that arrangement, it was not possible to make a clear assessment of the mainstream Muslim brother, the radical Muslim brother, and the Salafi development. The elections are, I think, a very important signal that in the last 30 years, it's not just the pragmatic trend. I mean, I tend to agree that in addition to what I've been talking about, in addition to that, you have this emergence of a radical margin in religious activity, in religious involvement in politics, and is much bigger. I think that radical margin is much bigger in Egypt than people had thought. That you can do all sorts of rationalization and say, well, people voted for the Salafis because they. Not because they were Salafis, but something else. You can do all sorts of rationalizations. But quite frankly, getting almost 20% of the vote means that was something that really appealed. It really appealed. Now, where I would put it, one of the parts of the spectrum that I would say is that we're still in a time when it's difficult to identify what is the issue that is driving people, what is the question that people are trying to answer by their activism. And Abdullahi Naim, who is a Sudanese scholar who's in the law school at Emory and a very activist person in global human rights issues, a couple years ago wrote an essay that was very important in terms of secularism and modernization and so on. And he said that if you define the alternatives for a Muslim majority society as being either European-style, old-fashioned French laïcité secularism or extremist Islamic fundamentalism, if that's the alternatives that are defined, the overwhelming majority of the population would, if they had a free choice, vote for the fundamentalists rather than the secularists. And that's, I think, what we saw in Egypt. That the secular identified parties were small, disorganized. They didn't have even the kind of pragmatic program that the Brotherhood did. And it opened the way then, I think, for the Salafis to come in. I think that the shape of the spectrum varies very much depending on the local political circumstance. So that in Indonesia, where you have those two giant organizations, the Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama, with thousands of madrasas and so on, the Salafi alternative, Bashir with the Jamaat Islami of Indonesia, is a very small group. I mean, he's lucky to count 50 or 100 madrasas as opposed to the 15,000 of the Muhammadiyah. But that's because you have a strong mainstream kind of group. In Egypt, where the Brotherhood was restricted, this gave, I think, greater opportunity on the underground fringe for the Salafis. And I think that you have this full spectrum. Each country, part of it depends on the willingness of the government to be flexible with the Islamically oriented mainstream, which is what, say, the King of Morocco has done. King Mohammed has been reasonably flexible in providing opportunities for a more mainstream Islamically oriented party, as opposed to, say, for example, Egypt under Mubarak. But I think that I would agree that we have an emerging militant sectarianism as well that becomes then the major rival for the pragmatic Islamically oriented mainstream.
Thank you. Yep.
Hi, Carol Migdalovitz. It does seem that women were in the lead of the demonstrations in the various countries, but there also seems to be a problem of getting them into the next step.
Right.
If you look at the parliamentary elections in Egypt, there were very low numbers of women elected. If you look at the cabinet that's serving in the transitional government in Libya, it's got one woman. If you look at the government in Morocco, Ben Quran says he couldn't find a competent woman. That's a quote.
Yep.
And there are no women in the cabinet in Morocco. So it does seem to be an extraordinary democratic deficiency in these neo-Islamic governments that are being formed in the region if the women don't get to play a role. And also, it's a problem for these countries because of the socioeconomic problems that they're facing. And all the studies have shown that women need to participate in the workforce and the government for countries to make progress. So I think that we're premature to reach conclusions about the role of women in these societies.
The only conclusion that I would say is not premature is that their role and their strength is increasing over what it has been. And I think that it is interesting to me to note that the secular, so-called liberal parties give no more and often less opportunity to women than the Islamically oriented parties. This was definitely the case in Tunisia, for example. Nahda had more women on its ticket than the secular parties did, and the Brotherhood had more women on its party lists than any of the smaller secular parties did. So that I agree that the women have been in fact pushed back and pushed out, and it's the old-fashioned what happened after nationalism as well. There's a marvelous book called The Year of the Elephant, which talks about Moroccan nationalism coming out of the French, and all of the men were in prison. The women did most of the work, and the men came back and got into the cabinet positions. But I think that this is, what should we call it, equal opportunity misogyny. I don't think it's the religious identity of the political actors that is a distinguishing thing. I think that the secular so-called liberals have been as misogynist as the religious people, but it is a problem. I agree.
Thank you.
My name is Daniel Adams, and I was very interested in what you were talking about. I just have one question, or maybe comment and suggestion, and that is your use of the term pragmatic. Now, you said we should be careful about terminology. I think when you're using the word pragmatic, you might really want to say democratic, because when you identify the kinds of principles that people are looking for, particularly in the Egyptian revolution, and you identify them as creating a constitutional government, a non-authoritarian government, getting a schedule for elections. Well, these are having greater participation of the public in the formation of government policies. I think you could call those pragmatic, and they are. But I think you could, to address this gentleman's question over here, is there a core to what people are asking for? I think you can say, yes, it's pragmatic, but it's a democratic core of inspired ideas that are bringing this out into the forefront. And it's the fact that the appeal to the broad population is that they would like to see a democracy in their country. So I think you might want to sort of bring your own term of pragmatic democracy might be a better way to frame that. And I think one advantage of framing it that way is that Americans in particular don't think that the people in the Middle East even want or know what democracy is. Well, I think I think this Arab Spring has definitely shown that not to be true, that people around the whole world understand what democracy is and want it and are willing to fight for it. So I think even though it's pragmatic, I think we could call it a democratically inspired core, and that could be the principle that's behind the movement that you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would just simply say, if you want to go further in terms of concrete evidence for your comments about people around the world, Gallup poll, Gallup and Pew both, but Gallup poll it does a continuing global Muslim set of surveys and so on. And there is a book my colleague John Esposito has co-authored, which is "Who Speaks for a Billion Muslims?" And that it is this sort of thing. As you look at what do people aspire to, and democracy and human rights and gender equality are very high level desires. And yes, agree.
Thank you. The gentleman all the way in the back.
Yep. New technologies. This morning, the Malaysian Islamic government has decided to send back the Saudi user Twitter in Saudi Arabia, where he will be hanged probably before the end of this week. Do you think this is a kind of a democratic government? And second question, the University of Tunis has been occupied 2 months ago by Salafi students, about 200. The dean and students have been kicked off the university because they wanted to have the inside the university. The new Islamist, mainly Islamist, government has refused for 1 month and a half to send the police to have the exams and the normal that you have also in Georgetown University or in or in any university, free university in the world. How do you think is this connecting with the concept of democracy? Thank you.
I think it is not necessarily connecting with democracy, but it is showing a very, very problematic and difficult time of transition. I think that Egypt has its problems with the military, and the Tunisians have their own problems of adjustment. And I think that you're pointing to the occupation. There is a whole debate over how much flexibility can be given to the Salafis, which really is not necessarily productive. I'm trying to think. It's gotten some interesting coverage in the at the end of January. Tunisia faces a balancing act of democracy and religion, and you've got Anthony Shadid. If you're interested in following up, I mean, the question, the comment, is raising a very important issue in terms of the nature of the transition, and I would just call your attention to Anthony Shadid's article in the 31st of January, where basically he's talking about the whole problem of trying to define what can be an Islamically identifiable government program that isn't necessarily Salafi, but isn't also anti-religious. But it's a very important issue, and it's part of the real tensions that are there, even in what I think of as probably the place that's getting along best at the moment, and that's Tunisia. But I agree.
Okay. The first question was about Malaysia, but
Malaysia is one of those interesting, again, double lines of problems, and I think that the people, there are fewer people that could be called Salafi in important positions than is the case in many other places. But you have really very important issues that are taking place, that whether or not groups like the Ahmadis can be recognized as Muslims and survive without harassment. There are issues. One quick issue is a little while ago there was a Christian group, Malaysian Christian, not a missionary group, that was translating the gospel into local language. And there was a big dispute over whether or not they could translate God and use the term Allah in the translation. And what's interesting there is that the more Islamically oriented group, at least in terms of quick identification, the one that is associated with Anwar Ibrahim, the leader of the opposition, Abim, supported the idea that that the Christians should be able to use whatever term they wanted to, and it was the non-Islamically identified government working with conservative ulama who were trying to impose the ban on the use of Allah. The court system went in the more liberal direction, but there are lots of issues that are, some of them are maybe minor like Allah, or more major like outlawing the Ahmadi, that we find in all places, that we can find in Malaysia as well as elsewhere.
Thank you. Yep.
I'm Destiny Decker, and I just had a quick question, which I may follow up with a second, if depending on your answer. How are you defining a secularist? Is it someone who is void of religion, or just someone who doesn't want a theocracy?
There are two definitions of secularism, and this is where at one point I used the term laïcité. It depends on which kind of secularism you're talking about. There is what the Turks, what the AKP people like to talk about as you have the French version, laïcité, which is anti-clerical and thinks that religion and politics can or should be kept separate. There is the American First Amendment version that says politicians can be as religious as possible, but you need an institutional separation. And I think that what you have in the Arab Spring are both of those kinds of organizations, or both of those kind of sentiments. You have some, what I think of as the more old-style laïcité-oriented secularism that think that somehow religion and politics can be kept separate. And then you have the theocracy question, you have the institutional that says that the mullahs, the sheikhs of Azhar, and so on can provide guidance for the people, but they shouldn't be part of the government. And so that I define it in those two ways and see them as operating together.
And the reason I asked was because I think for at least in my studies, I would say that the problem is built into the Islamic Sharia, and that is why women are excluded from the system politically. And they're vocal in the movements and they're vocal in the demonstrations, and I think that's the point, because they're going against the Islamic Sharia system of how it's been for millennia. And I think that's also why it's not a quick fix just because they demonstrate and their faces are plastered on Fox News, CNN, Twitter, and Facebook, that they're not being able to establish themselves in the system, regardless of, you know, whether it is a theocracy or a democracy, because that problem is built into the Islamic system.
The problem is built into the Sharia as interpreted in the medieval great matrix. But one of the interesting things that's been happening in the last 15 or 20 years is that there are increasingly major efforts by prominent Muslims to break out of the box of the medieval Sharia and view Sharia in the whole different light. Gus Dur, you know, the head of the Nahdlatul Ulama and his 35 million followers. Gus Dur is not saying Sharia is bad. He's saying that Sharia, as understood by somebody who lived 600 years ago, isn't applicable in Indonesia today. He's not opposed to Sharia, but he is opposed to the medieval construct of Sharia. And so that one of the things, as we look at it, again, a place like Egypt is a very interesting case in point, that the Grand Mufti of Egypt, Ali Guma, is one of the important leaders internationally in the process, in the efforts to re-understand what Sharia is as a moral force. That as you look at younger Muslim scholars around the world, what is the nature of the Sharia? Who defines the Sharia? Sharia as discourse. These kind of phrases are very important in the arguments and debates. And so that I think it's very important not to agree with the Salafis and say Sharia is what Ibn Taymiyyah said it was 6 centuries ago, but rather to look at what it is that contemporary activist thinkers are trying to do to redefine Sharia in terms of advocacy of social justice, equality, and so on.
John, we still have 2 or 3 people at least who would like to...
Yes, but I think we're out of time. I don't know. I guess we can take one more question.
If I can make it very, very short, if the question can be very short, I can make my answer short.
Anybody with a very short final question? Otherwise, I do think we should give John a round of applause for this absolutely brilliant talk this afternoon.